In the summer of 2020, 28-year-old Amelia Evans packed her backpack for what should have been a routine weekend hike through the Sierra Nevada mountains. She was an experienced hiker who had conquered dozens of trails across California. Her nature photography had been featured in outdoor magazines, and she knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. That's what made her disappearance so impossible to understand. When Amelia vanished on that bright July morning, she left behind no trace, no clues, and no explanation. The massive search operation that followed involved helicopters scanning from above, search dogs combing the forest floor, and hundreds of volunteers calling her name through the wilderness. They found her car exactly where she'd parked it at the trailhead. Her camping gear was missing, suggesting she'd started her hike as planned. But after that, nothing. It was as if the mountains had swallowed her whole. For weeks, searchers covered every inch of her planned route and miles beyond. They checked ravines, searched caves, and even dragged nearby streams. Nothing. 5 years passed. The case went cold. Then, on a quiet afternoon in 2025, 2 teenage boys made a discovery that would finally answer the question that had haunted a family and an entire community. While kayaking on a remote alpine lake miles from any marked trail, they spotted something strange deep beneath the crystal-clear water. It was a sleeping bag, weighted down and snagged on a submerged log. When authorities opened that waterlogged bag, they found something that would crack open the mystery of Amelia Evans's fate. Amelia Evans was the kind of person who made detailed lists for everything. Her younger sister Chloe used to tease her about the color-coded spreadsheets she'd create for simple camping trips. But that attention to detail was part of what made Amelia such a skilled outdoorswoman. She never left anything to chance. On the morning of July the 15th, 2020, Amelia stood in her small apartment in Sacramento, methodically checking off items on her packing list. Water purification tablets, check. Emergency whistle, check. Satellite GPS beacon, check. She'd even packed an extra battery pack for her phone, though she knew reception would be spotty at best in the mountains. Her plan was simple but ambitious. She would tackle a challenging 30-mile loop trail that would take her deep into the backcountry over 3 days. She'd photographed wildflowers there before, but this time she hoped to capture the elusive mountain lions she'd seen tracks of on previous trips. Chloe stopped by that morning to see her sister off. At 23, she idolized Amelia's adventurous spirit, but worried about these solo trips. Their parents worried too, especially their mother, who would pace the house whenever Amelia was out in the wilderness. But Amelia had a gift for reassuring them. She showed Chloe the detailed itinerary she'd printed out, complete with expected checkpoint times and the exact coordinates where she planned to camp each night. She'd filed the same plan with the ranger station and had programmed check-in reminders on her phone. Everything was accounted for. The last photo Amelia sent was a selfie from the trailhead parking lot. In it, she's grinning, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her favorite blue backpack secured on her shoulders. The morning sun lights up the pine trees behind her. She texted it to Chloe with a simple message that would later haunt her sister. Beginning the adventure. Will check in tonight from camp. Love you. That evening came and went with no word from Amelia. Chloe tried not to worry. Cell service was unreliable in the mountains, and her sister had warned her about this. But Amelia had specifically said she'd reach a spot with reception by sunset. By the next morning, concern was turning to fear. Chloe called their parents, who immediately contacted the ranger station. When rangers checked the trailhead, they found Amelia's red Honda CR-V exactly where she'd said it would be. The doors were locked and nothing seemed disturbed. She had clearly started her hike as planned. The official search began immediately. The local sheriff's department mobilized their search and rescue team. Volunteers poured in from neighboring counties. The California National Guard provided helicopters with thermal imaging cameras. professional trackers brought specially trained search dogs. The media picked up the story, and soon Amelia's face was on every local news channel. Her story spread across social media with the hashtag #FindAmeliaEvans trending for days. The search was massive and methodical. Teams were assigned to grid patterns, ensuring every square foot of terrain was covered. They followed her planned route first, then expanded outward in ever-widening circles. The dogs picked up her scent from the parking lot and followed it for about 3 miles along the trail before losing it at a creek crossing. This was normal, the handlers explained. Water often disrupts scent trails, but it was the last confirmed trace of Amelia's path. The Sierra Nevada mountains are beautiful but unforgiving. The terrain includes steep granite cliffs, dense forests, and countless hidden ravines. Even in summer, temperatures can drop below freezing at night in the higher elevations. Afternoon thunderstorms appear without warning. Rivers swollen with snowmelt become dangerous torrents. Searchers faced all these challenges as they looked for any sign of the missing hiker. They found other hikers' lost gear from years past. They discovered illegal marijuana growing operations that had to be reported to law enforcement. They even rescued 2 other hikers who had gotten lost during the search itself. But of Amelia Evans, they found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a dropped water bottle, not even a footprint. After 3 weeks of intensive searching, the official operation was scaled back. The sheriff delivered the news to Amelia's family personally. They would continue to investigate any new leads, he assured them. But the active search phase was ending. Resources were limited, and without any clues to narrow the search area, they were essentially looking for a needle in a haystack the size of Connecticut. Chloe refused to give up. She organized volunteer searches every weekend for the next 2 months. She created a website with detailed maps and information, hoping someone, anyone, might have seen something. Their mother printed thousands of missing person flyers. Their father spent his savings hiring a private helicopter to search remote areas the official teams hadn't reached. Autumn came, then winter. The snow made searching impossible. The family was told to prepare for the possibility that Amelia might never be found. During those first agonizing weeks, investigators had pursued every possible angle. They interviewed everyone who knew Amelia, examined her finances, and scrutinized her digital footprint. That's when they discovered something that would cast a dark shadow over the next 5 years. In Amelia's apartment, detectives found her personal journal. Most entries were typical of an outdoor enthusiast. Notes about trails she wanted to explore, sketches of landscapes, pressed wildflowers between pages. But the entries from the weeks before her disappearance told a different story. She had recently ended a 2-year relationship with her boyfriend, Mark Thompson. The breakup had been messy. Journal entries described arguments, Mark's anger when she ended things, and her relief when she finally changed her apartment locks. One entry, dated just a week before her hike, was particularly troubling. Amelia had written about encountering Mark outside her workplace. He had been waiting by her car, wanting to talk. She described feeling uncomfortable and noted that he seemed different somehow, more intense. She'd ended the entry with a single line that investigators would read over and over. "Sometimes I wonder what he's capable of." Mark Thompson became the investigation's primary focus. The 32-year-old construction worker had dated Amelia for 2 years before their breakup in May 2020. Friends described their relationship as passionate but volatile. They'd broken up and reconciled multiple times before Amelia finally ended things for good. When detectives brought Mark in for questioning, he appeared nervous but cooperative. He claimed he'd been devastated by the breakup, but would never hurt Amelia. He said he'd been camping alone that weekend, trying to clear his head and move on. The problem was, he couldn't prove it. He'd gone to a dispersed camping area with no registration required. He had no receipts, no photos, no witnesses who could verify his whereabouts. His cell phone had been turned off the entire weekend, which he said was intentional. He'd wanted to disconnect from everything, including the temptation to call Amelia. The police searched his apartment, his vehicle, and his work locker. They found nothing connecting him to Amelia's disappearance. No evidence she'd been in his truck recently, no suspicious GPS data, no incriminating searches on his computer. But the lack of an alibi and the troubling journal entries were enough to keep him under suspicion. The court of public opinion was even harsher. Social media branded him a killer. His employer received so many threatening calls that they had to let him go. Vandals spray-painted "murderer" on his apartment door. Mark moved 3 times in 2 years, but someone always figured out who he was. He became a pariah, unable to escape the shadow of suspicion. Chloe found herself caught in an impossible position. Part of her wanted to believe Mark was responsible. It would mean there was someone to blame, someone who could potentially provide answers. But she'd known Mark for 2 years. He'd been at family dinners, had helped her move apartments, had seemed genuinely in love with her sister. The journal entries disturbed her, but were they really evidence of violence, or just the bitter words of a bad breakup? She visited Mark once, about a year after Amelia's disappearance. He was living in a small apartment 2 towns over, working night shifts at a warehouse to avoid people. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. He told her he thought about Amelia every day, that he'd loved her despite their problems. He swore on his mother's grave that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Chloe left that meeting more confused than ever. Years passed. The case grew cold. Amelia's parents aged rapidly under the weight of not knowing. They kept her room exactly as she'd left it, her hiking boots still by the door, waiting. Every anniversary of her disappearance, local news would run a segment asking if anyone had information. The response was always silence. Life moved forward, but for Amelia's family, time had stopped on July 15th, 2020. Everything changed on August 3rd, 2025. 16-year-old Dylan Martinez and his friend Josh Chen had convinced their parents to let them kayak on Sapphire Lake, a pristine alpine lake accessible only by a challenging 5-mile hike. They'd portaged inflatable kayaks up the trail, eager to fish in waters rarely visited by humans. The lake was stunning, surrounded by towering peaks and fed by snowmelt that kept the water crystal clear even in summer. The boys paddled slowly, enjoying the solitude and watching for trout in the depths below. It was Josh who spotted it first. About 20 feet down, something orange caught his eye. In a lake where everything was natural browns, greys, and greens, the unnatural colour stood out sharply. They paddled over and peered down through the clear water. It looked like fabric of some kind, snagged on a submerged log. Dylan thought it might be a tent that had blown into the lake during a storm. Josh wondered if it was trash left by careless campers. They decided to try pulling it up. The boys used their paddle to hook the fabric, but it was heavier than expected, much heavier. It took both of them pulling together to slowly raise it toward the surface. As it got closer, they could see it was a sleeping bag, and something was weighing it down from inside. For a moment, they both had the same terrible thought. What if there was a body inside? They almost let go, but curiosity won over fear. They managed to drag the waterlogged bag to the edge of the lake. It was sealed with multiple stuff sacks and compression straps, clearly deliberate. Someone had wanted this to sink and stay sunk. Dylan's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. Even at 16, he knew this was something for adults to handle. Miraculously, he had 1 bar of signal. The 911 call was brief. 2 boys, a lake, a weighted sleeping bag. The dispatcher kept them on the line, telling them not to touch anything else, to wait for help to arrive. It took 3 hours for the sheriff's deputies to reach the lake. They arrived with a forensics team, prepared for the worst. The boys watched from a distance as the officers carefully cut open the sleeping bag. Everyone expected to find human remains. Instead, they found a large rock for weight and a waterproof container, the kind used to protect documents on boats. The container was sealed with waterproof tape and marked with permanent marker in handwriting that was still barely visible. It read simply, "Please find this." Inside the container were two items: a professional camera in a waterproof housing and a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic. Even through the protective layers, both items showed significant water damage. The camera's screen was cracked, and the journal's pages were warped and discolored. But they were intact. The deputies immediately recognized the potential significance. They carefully packaged everything and rushed it to the state forensics lab. Within hours, investigators had matched the handwriting on the container to samples from Amelia Evans's apartment. After 5 years, they finally had a clue. The forensics lab faced a monumental challenge. The camera's memory card had suffered severe corrosion, despite the protective housing. Standard recovery techniques failed immediately. The journal was in even worse condition. Water had caused the ink to bleed and pages to stick together. Opening it carelessly would destroy any information it contained. The team brought in specialists from the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit and document restoration experts from the Library of Congress. The process was painstaking. For the camera, they had to carefully disassemble the memory card under a microscope, cleaning each component with specialized solvents. They tried dozens of recovery software programs, each time getting error messages or corrupted files. The breakthrough came when they tried an older, slower recovery method, typically used for damaged drives from the 1990s. It managed to reconstruct fragments of the photo files. Out of probably hundreds of photos on the card, they recovered exactly 17 partial images and 5 complete ones. The journal restoration was equally delicate. Experts used a freeze-drying technique to separate the pages without tearing them. Then they photographed each page under different light spectrums. Infrared lighting revealed ink that was invisible to the naked eye. Advanced software analyzed the patterns, reconstructing words letter by letter. It took 3 weeks of round-the-clock work. In the end, they recovered about 40% of the journal's contents, including, crucially, the last 8 pages. When lead investigator Detective Sarah Kim finally sat down to review the recovered materials, she had to steel herself. She'd worked missing persons cases for 15 years, but there was something uniquely haunting about reading someone's final words, especially when those words had traveled such an unlikely journey to reach them. The recovered photos told the beginning of the story. The first showed Amelia on the trail, smiling and holding up a rare wildflower she'd found. The second captured a stunning sunrise from what appeared to be her first night's campsite. The third showed her boots on a narrow trail with a steep drop visible to one side. The fourth photo changed everything. It was poorly framed, blurry, taken from an odd angle. It showed Amelia's leg, clearly broken, the bone visible through torn skin. The background revealed she was in some kind of narrow ravine, rock walls rising on all sides. The fifth and final complete photo was taken from where she lay, pointing straight up. Sheer rock faces boxed her in, with only a small patch of sky visible far above. Based on the shadows, the walls had to be at least 60 feet high. There was no way out, not with a shattered leg. The journal entries filled in the horrifying details. The earliest recovered entry was dated July 17, 2020, 2 days into her trip. In shaky handwriting, Amelia had written about the fall. She'd been traversing a narrow ridge, following what she thought was a game trail to get a better photo angle of the valley below. The edge had crumbled without warning. She'd tumbled approximately 40 feet bouncing off rocks, before landing hard in a hidden ravine. The pain in her leg had been immediate and overwhelming. She'd passed out, waking hours later to find the sun had moved across the sky. Her training had kicked in. She'd fashioned a splint from branches and torn clothing. She'd taken inventory of her supplies. She had enough food for maybe 5 more days if she rationed carefully, and water was not a problem, as a small stream ran through the ravine. But she'd quickly realized the hopelessness of her situation. The ravine was like a natural prison. The walls were nearly vertical, smooth granite with few handholds. Even if her leg had been fine, climbing out would have required technical gear she didn't have. With a compound fracture, it was impossible. She'd tried everything her pain would allow. She'd blown her emergency whistle until her breath gave out, but the sound just echoed off the walls, trapped like she was. Her phone had no signal. The GPS beacon, her one real hope, had been damaged in the fall and wouldn't power on. She'd tried signaling with her mirror, but the narrow opening above meant sunlight only entered for about an hour each day. The journal entries became shorter as days passed, preserving energy and battery life for her camera. July 18th. Heard a helicopter today. So close. Screamed until my throat bled. They didn't hear me. July 19th. Leg infected. Fever. Using last antibiotics from first aid kit. July 20th. Acceptance coming. Wrote letters to family on separate pages. Will try to preserve them. July 21st. Can see Sapphire Lake from here. Maybe half-mile away, but might as well be on the moon. The final entry, dated July 22nd, 2020, was different. The handwriting was steadier, more deliberate. Amelia had made a decision. If someone finds this, please tell my family I loved them until the end. I'm not giving up. I'm choosing how my story ends. I've spent 5 days trying to survive, but now I want to do something more important. I want to give my family answers. I know what not knowing does to people. I watched my mum spend 3 years wondering if her brother was alive after he disappeared sailing. The not knowing was worse than grief. I won't do that to them. I can see Sapphire Lake from here. It's about 50 feet away, down a steep but reachable slope. I'm going to put this journal and my camera in the waterproof container, seal it in my sleeping bag with rocks, and use my last strength to get it to the lake. The water is deep there. The bag should sink and stay preserved in the cold. Someone will find it eventually. Maybe not for years, but someday. Mum, Dad, Chloe, I'm so sorry. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. But know that I'm not suffering. I'm at peace. I've had 5 days to watch the stars, to listen to the water, to think about all the beautiful moments we shared. Chloe, you were the best sister anyone could ask for. Live your life. Have adventures. Fall in love. Don't let my ending stop your beginning. Mark, if you read this, I'm sorry for what you've probably gone through. We had our problems, but I know you would never hurt me. I hope you find peace. To whoever finds this, thank you. Thank you for giving my family closure. Please tell them I was brave. Tell them I fought. And tell them that in my last moments, I was thinking of them. Using the photos and topographical maps, search teams pinpointed the likely location of the ravine. It was nearly 2 miles from Amelia's planned route, in an area so remote it hadn't been included in the original search grid. The ravine was hidden from above by overhanging rocks and vegetation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. A technical rescue team rappelled down on August 29th, 2025. They found Amelia's remains exactly where her journal indicated she would be, near the edge where she'd dragged herself to reach the slope down to the lake. Her final act had required incredible determination. With a shattered leg and dying of infection, she had somehow made it 50 feet to the water's edge and thrown the weighted bag far enough into the lake to ensure it would sink into the deep water. Next to her body, they found the pages she'd mentioned, letters to her family wrapped in plastic and tucked under a rock. The letters were badly damaged but partially readable. Each one was filled with love, memories, and the request that they not blame themselves or anyone else for what happened. The news of the discovery spread quickly. After 5 years of mystery, the Evans family finally had answers. It was devastating to know how Amelia had suffered, but there was also something profoundly meaningful in understanding her final days. She hadn't simply vanished. She hadn't left them wondering. Even facing death, she had thought of them, had found a way to reach across time to give them closure. Mark Thompson was formally cleared of any involvement. The police held a press conference apologizing for the years of suspicion he'd endured. Some people apologized, others simply moved on to the next scandal. Mark would later say that Amelia's journal entry about him was the first peace he'd felt in 5 years. He knew she'd known he was innocent. That was enough. Chloe took possession of her sister's recovered camera and journal. She had the final photo Amelia had taken, the one looking up from the ravine, professionally printed and framed. It was a strange thing to display, some people thought, but for Chloe, it represented her sister's incredible strength. Even trapped, even dying, Amelia had looked up. She'd found beauty in that small patch of sky. She'd found purpose in her final moments. The Evans family held a proper memorial service on September 15th, 2025, exactly 5 years and 2 months after Amelia's disappearance. Hundreds of people attended, including many of the volunteers who had searched for her. Dylan and Josh, the boys who had found the sleeping bag, were given special recognition. Without their discovery, the family might never have known what happened. The family established the Amelia Evans Foundation for Wilderness Safety. They worked with park services to improve trail marking in remote areas and funded research into better emergency beacon technology. They wanted to ensure that future hikers who found themselves in trouble would have a better chance of being found. Chloe became an advocate for solo hiker safety, though she was careful never to discourage people from pursuing their adventures. That wouldn't have been what Amelia wanted. Instead, she focused on preparation, on the importance of reliable communication devices, on the value of checking in regularly. She often spoke at hiking clubs and outdoor retailers, sharing her sister's story, not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration. Even facing the worst possible situation, Amelia had found a way to show love, to provide comfort, to think of others. That was her true legacy. The ravine where Amelia died was eventually named Evans Canyon by the local hiking community, though it never appeared on official maps. A small, unofficial memorial was placed at the rim, a simple plaque that read, "For those who look up, even from the depths." Hikers who knew the story would sometimes leave wildflowers there, the kind Amelia had loved to photograph. Sapphire Lake remained pristine and remote, visited only by the most determined backpackers. But those who made the journey now knew its secret. It had been a messenger, holding Amelia's final words safe in its cold depths until the right moment came for them to be found. The lake had kept its promise, delivering her message when her family needed it most. In interviews years later, Chloe would often be asked how she felt about those 5 years of not knowing. She would think carefully before answering. The not knowing had been agony, she would say. Every day had brought false hopes and crushing disappointments. But in a strange way, those 5 years had also been a gift. They had forced her to confront the uncertainty that underlies all of life. They had taught her that closure, when it comes, is precious beyond measure. They had shown her that love transcends even death, that her sister's final act had been one of pure love. When people asked if she still hiked, she would smile. Of course she did. She hiked with better equipment, with more careful planning, with a healthy respect for the mountain's power. But she hiked. It was what Amelia would have wanted. On every trail, she carried a waterproof container with emergency supplies and a written note with her exact coordinates, updated at each rest stop. It was probably excessive, but it gave her peace of mind. The story of Amelia Evans became a legend in the hiking community, not a cautionary tale about the dangers of solo hiking, but a testament to human resilience and love. Forums discussed her case with reverence, analysing what might have been done differently, but always concluding with respect for how she had faced her fate. Her photographs, recovered from her apartment and previous trips, were eventually published in a book called Looking Up: The Photography of Amelia Evans. All proceeds went to wilderness search and rescue organisations. The introduction, written by Chloe, ended with a simple line that captured everything. She taught us that even in our darkest moments, we can choose to be a light for others. The technical details of the accident were studied by wilderness safety experts. The ridge Amelia had been traversing was subsequently marked as hazardous, though reaching it required going significantly off trail. The type of fall she experienced, while rare, was not unprecedented. The hidden ravine she'd fallen into was one of dozens in the area, carved by ancient glaciers and hidden from aerial view. It was a reminder that even experienced hikers could encounter situations beyond their control. What made Amelia's story unique wasn't the accident itself, but her response to it. Faced with certain death, she had turned her final days into an act of service. She had documented everything she could, not for herself, but for those she would leave behind. She had found a way to throw a message across 5 years of time, ensuring her family wouldn't spend their lives wondering. The weighted sleeping bag became an artifact of sorts, carefully preserved in evidence storage. The forensics team had marvelled at Amelia's ingenuity. By using multiple waterproof layers and choosing the deepest, coldest part of the lake, she had created conditions that would preserve the contents for decades if necessary. It was brilliant thinking from someone who must have been delirious with pain and infection. Her story inspired changes in emergency beacon technology. Companies developed new devices that could withstand greater impacts and transmit from deeper in canyons. Some included automatic fall detection that would trigger an SOS even if the hiker was unconscious. These devices would save lives, though they couldn't help everyone. The wilderness would always carry risks that no technology could completely eliminate. Mark Thompson eventually moved to another state, starting fresh where nobody knew his connection to the case. He worked in construction, lived quietly, and never gave interviews about those 5 years under suspicion. Friends said he kept a photo of him and Amelia from happier times, not hidden but not displayed either. He dated occasionally but never married. Some wounds, even when cleaned of suspicion, leave permanent scars. The 2 boys who found the sleeping bag, Dylan and Josh, were changed by the experience. Both became involved in search and rescue as adults. Dylan would later say that finding Amelia's message had taught him that every action we take ripples outward in ways we can't imagine. A camping trip had turned into solving a 5-year mystery. A terrible tragedy had become a story of love and determination. Park rangers in the Sierra Nevada would sometimes share Amelia's story around campfires, especially with young hikers who seemed overconfident. They would describe her experience, her preparation, how even the best planning couldn't prevent every accident, but they would always end with her final act, how she had thought of others even while facing death. It was a powerful reminder that wilderness respect and human compassion were equally important. The story reached beyond the hiking community. Psychologists studied it as an example of how people face mortality. Philosophers discussed the ethics of closure and the human need for answers. Writers tried to capture the strange beauty of those 5 years when a message waited patiently at the bottom of a lake, a time capsule of love and loss. Amelia's parents, David and Maria Evans, aged gracefully after the closure. The not knowing had been eating them alive, but understanding brought its own kind of peace. They knew their daughter had been brave. They knew she had thought of them. They knew she hadn't suffered indefinitely, but had chosen her ending with the same determination she'd brought to everything in life. They kept her room as it was for one more year, then donated her camping gear to young hikers who couldn't afford quality equipment. It was what she would have wanted. On the anniversary of her death each year, the family would hike to a viewpoint Amelia had loved, not far from home and safely accessible. They would sit together, share memories, and watch the sunset paint the mountains gold. They would remember her not as she died, but as she lived, vibrant and fearless and full of joy. Sometimes Chloe would bring her own camera, taking photos of the same flowers her sister had loved. She had inherited Amelia's eye for beauty, her patience for the perfect shot. But she also carried the hard-won wisdom of loss, the knowledge that every adventure, every photo, every moment with loved ones was precious, precisely because nothing was guaranteed. The journal and camera were eventually donated to a wilderness museum, part of an exhibit on survival and the human spirit. Visitors would stand before the water-damaged artifacts, reading excerpts from Amelia's final entries, often wiping away tears. The exhibit wasn't about tragedy, but about triumph, about how one person facing the worst had chosen to think of others. School groups would visit, and teachers would use Amelia's story to discuss courage, preparation, and compassion. Children would ask why she didn't just try to climb out, and guides would explain about the importance of realistic assessment, of knowing when to shift from survival to legacy. It was a complex lesson for young minds, but an important one. The forensics experts who had recovered the data from the camera and journal received commendations for their work. They had given a family answers and allowed a young woman's final message to be delivered. One technician kept a printed copy of Amelia's last photo, the one looking up from the ravine, pinned to his workspace. He said it reminded him that his technical work had human meaning, that every recovered file might be someone's final word. As years passed, technology continued to improve. Satellite coverage expanded, emergency beacons became more reliable, and rescue techniques advanced. But the wilderness remained wild, and people continued to venture into it seeking adventure, solitude, and beauty. They carried better tools, but the same human spirit that had driven Amelia Evans into the mountains that July morning. Her story became part of hiking folklore, shared at trailheads and camping stores. Details might vary in the telling, but the core remained the same. A woman had fallen where no one could find her. She had faced death with courage. She had found a way to send a message across time, and two boys fishing on a remote lake had pulled that message from the depths, ending 5 years of questions with difficult but necessary answers. The spot where Amelia fell was never officially marked, but experienced hikers knew it. They would pause there sometimes, looking down into the hidden ravine, imagining those 5 days of suffering and strength. Some would leave small stones in a pile, an informal memorial to someone who had turned tragedy into a final act of love. Chloe eventually married and had children of her own. She named her daughter Amelia, not out of sadness, but out of hope. She wanted her daughter to carry her aunt's spirit of adventure, tempered with wisdom about the mountain's power. Young Amelia grew up hearing stories about her namesake, about the importance of preparation, about the beauty of wild places, and about the strength to think of others, even in our darkest moments. The Sapphire Lake area was eventually designated as a wilderness area, protecting it from development. The lake remained pristine, accessible only to those willing to make the difficult journey. It seemed fitting that the place that had held Amelia's message would remain untouched. A reminder that some things are worth preserving exactly as they are. In quiet moments, Chloe would think about those 5 years of not knowing. She would remember the false leads, the desperate searches, the slow, crushing weight of uncertainty. But she would also remember the moment when the sheriff called to say they'd found something. The mixture of hope and terror, the careful viewing of recovered photos, the tears when she read her sister's final words. Closure, even painful closure, was a gift. Amelia's story reminds us that the wilderness, for all its beauty, demands respect. It reminds us that even the most prepared can face the unexpected. But most of all, it reminds us that love transcends circumstance, that human beings are capable of extraordinary acts of compassion even when facing death. In those 5 days at the bottom of a ravine, Amelia Evans had proven that our final acts can be our most meaningful. The fishing boys, Dylan and Josh, remained friends into adulthood. Every few years, they would return to Sapphire Lake, not to fish, but to remember. They would think about that day when they'd pulled something orange from the depths, not knowing they were about to solve a 5-year mystery. They understood they had been instruments of closure, chosen by chance to deliver a message that had waited patiently in the cold water. They felt honored by that role, humbled by their part in Amelia's story. Search and rescue teams studied Amelia's case extensively, using it to refine their procedures. They mapped more hidden ravines, developed better protocols for off-trail searches, and emphasized the importance of never giving up hope. Her story became required reading in wilderness survival courses, not as a failure, but as a masterclass in maintaining humanity in desperate circumstances. The weighted sleeping bag technique entered survival manuals as the Evans Protocol, a last resort method for ensuring important information survives, even if the person doesn't. It was morbid but practical, acknowledging that sometimes the best we can do is ensure our story is told. Instructors would teach it solemnly, hoping their students would never need it, but knowing that if they did, it might bring comfort to grieving families. Amelia's photography equipment was studied by outdoor photography schools. Her technique for protecting her camera, even while dying, became a case study in dedication to craft. Students would learn that she had continued taking photos even after her fall, documenting her situation with the professionalism that had defined her life. It was a reminder that passion for our work can sustain us even in the darkest moments. The mountains that had claimed Amelia's life continued to draw adventurers. Every season brought new hikers to the trails she had loved, each carrying their own dreams and taking their own risks. Park rangers would see them at trailheads, checking maps, adjusting packs, taking those excited first steps into the wilderness. They would think of Amelia Evans, who had done the same thing one July morning, never knowing it would be her last adventure. But the rangers also knew that for every tragedy, there were thousands of successful trips, millions of moments of wonder and joy in wild places. The mountains gave more than they took, even if what they took was sometimes devastating. Amelia's story became a reminder that we are all temporary visitors in wild places, that the mountains were here long before us and will remain long after we're gone. But it also proved that human connections can transcend time and distance, that love can find a way even from the depths of a hidden ravine. Her final message, carried by a weighted sleeping bag through 5 years of cold lake water, stands as one of the most powerful examples of determination in the face of death. Amelia Evans disappeared on a solo hike in 2020, but her spirit, her message, and her love reached her family in 2025, bringing them the closure they desperately needed. Her incredible foresight in those final moments is a testament to her character. What did you think of her story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. For more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.